Good morning, everybody, on this lovely, beautiful sunny morning in West Yorkshire, and I hope it's as lovely where you are too. And welcome to the Curia Levelling Up Commission. And today our inquiry is focused on housing and homelessness. So, housing and homelessness. Our first panel today is around the transition to green energy and existing challenges. So before I introduce our two excellent speakers this morning, I'm just going to give you a little bit of preamble about this particular panel. So the Committee on Climate Change published a report on the future of UK housing in 2019, which highlighted that UK housing was not fit for future, with lags and shortcomings in meeting targets laid out to tackle climate change. The building of new homes and retrofitting in existing homes fall short of set standards, given the long-standing focus of the National Planning Policy Framework on increasing use and supply of green energy. The Commission needs to understand how this can be achieved and better implemented through devolution of power, and in turn, its impact on well-being and reduction in inequality amongst different population groups. The direct impact of poorly insulated homes is felt not just in poor accessibility to safe housing and growing urban poverty, but also in its impact on health, education, well-being and welfare. So in light of this, the panel will look at the role and significance of local authorities to meet these energy standards for housing in line with the UK's energy efficiency targets, and will explore the housing quality as a determinant of socio-economic inequalities in the UK. So I'm delighted that we're joined today by Richard Miller, who is the Associate Director of Connected Places Catapult. And we also have the equally excellent James Dyson, who is a Senior Researcher from E3G. And I've just realised in my incredible panic this morning around IT challenges and problems, I haven't even taken the time to introduce myself, which is very remiss of me. So just before we move on to our panellists this morning, hello everybody, I'm Paula Sheriff and I'm the chair of the Curia Levelling Up Commission. I'm in a former life, I was a Member of Parliament in Dewsbury in West Yorkshire, and also a Shadow Minister for Mental Health and Social Care. So that's a little bit about me. And we're joined by a number of our panellists this morning. So you'll be hearing from them. They may well have some questions later on in the panels. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Richard Miller. Richard, I believe you're going to talk for somewhere between sort of 6 and 8 minutes, and then there'll be the opportunity for questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paula. So good morning, everybody. So I'm going to approach this question starting with the net zero challenge and then showing how that connects with quality of life issues, health and well-being, the economy, and ultimately to place, because that's a very important part of it. And the first thing to understand is there is no route to net zero without decarbonising the built environment. It's simply not possible. And the reason for that is the built environment accounts for about 40% of UK CO2 emissions. 23% of that is in day-to-day operations of the building, and 17% is embodied in the materials and construction. And so as we tackle operational emissions by decarbonising energy in various forms, embodied carbon becomes a bigger issue. And I just want to get that in there because that's something we're not careful, we forget about that. And that will become increasingly important over time as we travel towards net zero. So on the operational energy side, about 3/4 of the carbon emissions from the built environment comes from direct use of fossil fuels in buildings for space and water heating. The indirect emissions, which is imported into the building through the electricity supply, account for about 27%. And if we then subdivide that further, 56%, so just over half, comes from the use of fossil fuels, mostly gas, in our homes. And therefore, this is the challenge. The challenge becomes one of dealing with the heating. And we know how to fix this problem to a large extent. We can create very energy efficient homes. We have many successful demonstrators for new build homes of different types. One example I'm fond of is Agile Property, who are building net zero ready homes using timber framing and straw bale insulation. And those properties actually start as a carbon bank, actually carbon negative to start with because of the long-term use of mass timber. We can dramatically cut operational emissions from a large number of existing buildings. Again, looking at homes, traditional styles of homes, low-rise developments. We've seen work done in the Netherlands, very, very efficient low-rise housing developments by using external wall insulation, replacing the roofs, doors and windows, and then using low-carbon heating. They can take existing properties and take them up to a very high standard, and even high-rise. So there's a project in Glasgow, Cedar Court, 3 high-rise towers built in the 1960s, and these now look like new and perform better than most new builds. So we can do both new build and retrofit to the required energy efficiency standards. We know how to do it. And that's important because if we look at that, if we look at the plan, which is broadly speaking to switch to electric heating of one form or another, that's how we're going to get our buildings to net zero. At the moment, the winter heat demand in the UK is 6 times the summer heat demand. The electricity demand is relatively stable throughout the year. But even if you kind of go with the best one in the world, we can have moderately energy efficiency homes, we can have heat pumps with a coefficient of performance of 3, so you get 3 times as much heat out as you put electricity in, things like that. You still end up planning to double the carrying capacity of our electricity grid just for the heating. And then you kind of throw in electric vehicles on top of that, and it becomes electric transport. It becomes even more complicated. So we have this interesting challenge, which comes again to place. How do we think about place? Because the options, the opportunities, the possibility of creating the grid and bringing everything together, the archetypes of the local buildings are all very, very different. But the key thing is we do know how to create very energy efficient homes, both in new build and retrofit. But we're not doing it fast enough, cost effectively enough, and reliably enough. And we need different kinds of solutions. We need both policy drivers and better innovation, more innovation. So although we know kind of physically how to do it, we need better solutions that reduce cost, improve performance, and critically are easier to install, use, and maintain. Because we have another huge problem in the transition, which is about the skills availability. And then we need that market pull. The problem is people do not wish to invest in the innovation and the scaling up of some of these solutions if there is no market pull, and that comes largely from policy drivers. So governments, both national, regional, and local, must demand change. They must use whatever levers they have in their power to demand change, to set clear targets and mean it. And the policy needs to be outcome oriented, focused on the target and not the specific means that you're going to use in this particular case, because you need the space for innovation. Whatever the policy, you have to set a direction and stick to it, and we cannot keep changing our mind. And that is something governments at all levels have been historically very bad at. We have lots of examples where we've had a policy, not stuck to it, frustrated people, cost money, and made it very, very difficult to move again. So there is innovation out there. There's plenty of innovation that needs supporting, and it needs public investment to sustain it through to scaling and reduction in cost and full market delivery. Skills are a key problem, and there's skills at many, many different levels. There are skills at the installer level, there are skills at the design level, at the planning level, and particularly energy planning, how we're going to manage this transition to largely electrically driven heating How is the grid going to cope? How are we going to have distributed energy generation systems that work together with more efficient homes? And all of that, if we can achieve that, we can start to achieve low carbon efficient homes, but we also need to think about the impact on other parts of society. Clearly, if we can have a major program to do this, which is locally rooted, you improve the local economy. You also start to tackle fuel poverty, and you start to tackle the health issues that come with that. And I just want to finish off by referencing one project I saw where the benefit of the project was in a way that I had not expected. So this is a project done in Nottingham. It was a demonstrator project retrofitting a series of homes owned by Nottingham City Homes. And I was talking to some of the residents after the project had completed, and I said, well, what was it like for you? What were the good things? And someone said, oh, it's fantastic. The house is so much bigger. And I thought, well, what does that mean? Because the house is exactly the same size. It wasn't that, it was external wall insulation, new roof, all the things that we talk about. And they said, no, the house is much bigger. And what it turned out was that because they were in fuel poverty, the family had to kind of huddle into a couple of rooms during the winter time, and the rest of the house was left cold. With better insulation and lower cost heating, the whole of the house could be used throughout the year. And that meant the kids could do their homework in their bedroom, people were not crunched in the same place. Now, I'm old enough that I kind of grew up like that, with coal-fired houses, coal-heated houses, open hearths. You were very, very careful which rooms you used, and the bedroom was largely for sleeping in the winter. You didn't use it for any other purpose, and you all huddled into small rooms together. Those kinds of impact can have both health and well-being impacts. They can reduce asthma problems, they can produce all kinds of benefits, and they also allow greater economic development over time because they have educational impacts and lots of other impacts. So I think the challenge is to take that integrated view. If I was to criticize where we are at the moment, is that every part of the problem, people are trying to solve it individually as a standalone. And we need to bring the whole thing together into an integrated, multidisciplinary approach involving the planners, involving the designers, involving the architects, the material providers, the energy providers, the health service. All these people need to come together because the benefits spread across many different parts of society, and we don't often see that, and we don't calculate it, we don't account for it, and therefore we look at projects and go, that's not cost effective. So I think I'll stop there, Paula, and that was my kind of introductory topic.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. That was excellent, and I particularly enjoyed your part at the end where we were talking about the wider determinants and getting everybody in the same room, virtual or otherwise. That was very, very relevant, and we'll undoubtedly have some questions for you after we've from James. Can I just encourage people to use the chat facility on here? If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to pop them in there, and we'll hopefully get to those shortly. So next, I'm delighted that we're joined by James Dyson from E3G, and James is going to give a presentation, and then we'll open the room up for questions. So over to you, James. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Paula, and also to Richard for that intro. I think both our presentations tied nicely together in terms of us being able to they complement each other quite well. Just quickly, E3G is an independent climate change think tank. We operate globally, but my team is entirely focused on decarbonisation of heat and buildings in the UK. We coordinate two interest groups, energy efficiency infrastructure group and electrify heat, as well as doing our own research and lobbying. I'm going to quickly run through 5 main barriers that we see to a place-based transition for decarbonised heat and better quality homes in the UK. And that first one is the inconsistent public funding, current inequality between local governments in the UK, failures in spatial and local planning, and also, as Rich has mentioned, a disconnect in energy planning in the UK. And then finally, as also Richard mentioned, skills in the supply chain. In terms of public funding, retrofit is extremely expensive, so is therefore out of the reach of many homes, which makes public funding for this crucial. And the government's flagship scheme for retrofitting low-income homes, the energy company obligation, has also collapsed over the past decade. Meanwhile, more recent locally led schemes have suffered from this stop-start public funding. In terms of our local governments, they could definitely be crucial coordinators for place-based retrofit. However, in recent research that I've done this year, seen the level of inequality between different local governments, where we have some absolute leaders in the country, while we have many authorities struggling with the intensity of the procurement process that's associated with a big retrofit project, which leads to high levels of under-delivery or high cost projects per sort of measure or house. Therefore, making the most of our local governments will need time and investment for quality and high scale delivery. In our sort of spatial and local planning, we've seen that heat pump restrictions, planning regulations on heat pumps are well out of date, relating to the noise that they emit, distance to boundary walls and fences, and also to the actual size of the heat pump, which leads to unnecessary delays in around a sort of a quarter or to a third of heat pump installations, and it varies significantly between local governments. We've seen some local governments, such as West Oxfordshire, trying to max out the sustainability of new developments by tying in their local energy plan, local area plan, with stricter building regulations, but the actual MPPF, the planning system, has blocked this. Meanwhile, conservation zones tend to restrict and frustrate retrofit efforts. And finally, the planning system is under-resourced, meaning that officers are really strapped for their time. As Richard said, and he's going to talk about this in much greater depth than I can, but the level of coordination between DNOs, district network operators, and our local authorities is currently very poor, and local area energy planning is not funded in England, although it is to be funded in Wales and is currently already funded in Scotland, meaning that only wealthier local governments in England are currently doing local area energy planning. In terms of skills in the supply chain, the main thing that we hear from the private sector is that a stable and profitable revenue stream will lead to inward investment. And currently the public sector isn't, the public sort of public retrofit schemes are not delivering that stability. Meanwhile, our local governments do have a role in ensuring that training is available and that practicing sort of retrofit procurement will make them more aware of their local supply chain and what they can do to support it. So now to talk about some more solutions, so it's not only complaints. In terms of the public schemes that we've got, as I mentioned, the energy company obligation and those local government schemes, we need to sort of look at returning to a higher volume of installations, obviously while protecting consumers for failures, i.e. Causing damp and mold through retrofit, which has happened in the past, which can be done through various sort of technical adjustments to the schemes, and also a broad sort of examinations of the principles of those schemes. And also national government should indicate an increasing role for local government in retrofit while resourcing them accordingly to undertake that. E2G suggested a sort of a financing mechanism for local government to do that, which develops the existing schemes. We think that removing arbitrary heat pump planning restrictions while balancing conservation with energy efficiency in the national planning policy framework is going to be essential as well. We also want local governments to be able to introduce restricting building requirements where possible, while indicating an upward trajectory at the national level and sticking to increases in national standards, for example, EPCC for the private rented sector, but also introducing support for landlords and relevant stakeholders to be able to do that. which we haven't seen over the past few years since that standard was suggested. We want coordination between district network operators and local government, and also resource for local area energy planning. And finally, to provide a stable and profitable work for publicly funded retrofit, which will in turn strengthen the private supply chain. That's all. Thanks very much, Ben.
Thank you, James. That's fantastic. And we're now going to move on to questions. I noticed that we also have some comments in the chat, which we'll look at as well. Can I ask our commissioners initially if they'd like to come in with any questions? I understand we have Anita Dockley, we have Neil Carmichael, and we have Lord Dennis Stevenson with us today. If I've missed anybody off, please feel free to shout up. Neil, I can see that you've got your hand up initially.
Both of the speakers have actually talked about bringing people together, but of course the key question is who's going to do the convening. Is it going to be the local authorities? Is it going to be mayors? Is it going to be some combination of regional structures or whatever? It could, of course, be the nation. This row about concrete in schools is to some extent about who's actually responsible, or who thinks that they are responsible, who thinks that they're not responsible. And I think that this is the key thing about housing, generally speaking, which is that we have too many organisations which do not talk to each other, and we need to get them around that table. So my question is, who does the convening?
So I try to put a brief answer, Neil, in the comments. The answer is everybody, because you need different levels of thinking and planning. So you could, for example, have the national government working together with trade associations, professional associations, universities, and knowledge base to say, okay, here are the ways in which we can tackle this. Here are the fundamental underpinning financial solutions that will help this transition to happen. But they can't decide what to do in Nottingham or Leicester or Bangor or whatever. Right, because the housing archetypes vary, the patterns of occupation vary, the energy supply opportunities vary. I mean, I'm no great fan of the idea of hydrogen for heating. It strikes me as bonkers. But there may be some unique cases where it makes a lot of sense. I live in rural North Wales. There are a lot of people here who are on oil. There are a lot of people in Northern Ireland who are oil heated. How we transition properties like that, is a different question. Is hydrogenated vegetable oil a quick fix that helps the process, or is it a snare and a delusion that we should avoid at all costs? So I think that you've got that balance. You need to create the framework, and I'm certainly finding a lot of interest from local authorities, particularly, or regional authorities. So I've been talking to Highlands and Islands. I've been talking to Glasgow. There's a lot of work going on in Wales, particularly in the Cardiff area, looking at what are the solutions that are going to work for us, given our mix of property, our economy, what we have available, and the opportunities. So I think it's about setting, if you like, high-level policy and framework, and then saying at the right level, like practical level, so what are we actually going to do about it? And if there are local authorities who don't want to take any action or think it's all too complicated, I personally will be going with the coalition of the willing in the first instance. Christ's sake, let's get this thing moving. And if Glasgow wants to sort out its problem, and if Belfast wants to sort out their problem, and Cardiff want to sort out their problems, all power to them. Let's get everybody behind them and make it happen, because there are innovators and people who want to enter the supply chain with new solutions, who are desperate to find customers. And don't forget that varies from part of the country to part of the country, but I think across the whole UK, about 17% of the total property base, housing base is social housing. There is a group that we could use to help pull some of this innovation and make it easier, make it more reliable. It worked with PV and wind. Government support around the globe over years has crashed the cost of doing that. And I think we could see the same in upgrading housing stock, providing the market is there. Well, everyone's looking at everyone else and saying, well, you fix it on your own, then there isn't enough demand to make the transition. So in England, there's a social housing decarbonisation fund, which is explicitly trying to get local authorities and housing associations to do 100 properties, because over the coming years, they're going to have to do thousands. So let's start the scale up process. Let's do the learning in order to make it possible to deploy these solutions at scale. Sorry, probably gone on far too long, but anyway.
Thank you. Good answer.
No, not at all, Richard. Thank you. Neil, did you want to come back there?
Well, I think this is something the Commission will really have to think about, because we've got to make some strong recommendations about delivery, because we're seeing government departments adjusted with new labels. We're seeing local authorities at their level, and we're seeing the arrival of more mayors, hopefully. What I worry about is that we can talk about getting everybody together, but they're all doing different things in our own patch. And I think that's where we need to learn a few things. And I think if you draw some examples on, for example, what goes on in Germany, where there's a much more consistency across the piece, because there's the structures in place to make sure that there is consistency. So I think that's what we need to do as a Commission.
Thank you, Neil. Okay, I apologise because I think Lara, one of our other commissioners, has also joined us as well. So I'm sorry for missing you initially, Lara.
No, it's my fault. It's because I was late, because I was having some
no.
extreme technical issues. Thank you.
Me
Thank
too.
you, Paula.
It seems to be the morning for IT challenges, because I'm in that boat as well, unfortunately. But you're very welcome, Lara. Do any of our other commissioners have any questions before we? I do have some pre-submitted questions that I can move to. Okay, we have something in the chat that I just wanted to highlight. So Judith says Eden District Council, now part of Westmoreland and Furness Council, I believe that's in Cumbria, has been taking forward lots of retrofit on a variety of properties over the area in the last 5 years. However, the funding to retrofit a traditional farmhouse on a fell side in Alston is not covered by the grants available, and there are concerns that fitting air source heat pumps and other electric systems may not be resilient enough in deeply rural areas where electricity cuts in winter may be common and long running, for example, after Storm Arwen. So I just wondered if either of our panelists would like to comment on that.
Comment on this. My colleague Anna in my team has just published a report on off-grid homes and the challenge that we face there. And it's certainly right, the concerns regarding electricity cuts and the different archetypes of off-grid homes. In terms of what will help, is we also need to consider the sort of the high cost of retrofitting some of these homes, but also considering that many sort of occupants may be asset rich but cash poor and therefore in fuel poverty. So it's clearly a difficult topic, and the Home Upgrade Grant by the government attempts to tackle this. However, there is quite a high level of under-delivery, largely because the cost of doing some of these homes can be very high and exceeds the cost caps within the project that the government puts in. In terms of what we think the solution is, we think that there should be a grant for an extension to heat pump grants for off-grid homes to make them more affordable in the first place, while making sure that district network operators, the energy suppliers, are able to reassure residents that electricity supply will be maintained. Heat pumps, when installed correctly, can still heat an off-grid property well. The off-grid properties also have the advantage of being able to install larger amounts of solar to support the heat pumps operation and reduce costs. So there are solutions, but I think special attention does need to be paid to these rural properties. And from a top-down perspective, how much the sort of national government as well as local authorities should be considering which properties are the most cost effective, both for fuel poverty and decarbonisation, more broadly, to start with at least.
Absolutely. Thank you, James.
If I can comment on that one as well.
Thank you.
Just to point out that, as I said, I live in rural North Wales, and I am still on oil-fired heating, still looking at the reasonably cost-effective ways of transitioning. It's not easy to work it out. But I suffered from the tail end of Storm Arwen and was out without electricity for 2 days. Funnily enough, the heating didn't work either, because that's also dependent on the electricity supply. So I think that sometimes we take this kind of oversimplistic view of it and say, well, you know, put electricity, certainly strains the heat, the grid more and makes you more dependent. But an awful lot of people, if they lose electricity supply, lose all their heating and cooking anyway. So part of the trick is more distributed, more granular energy systems, use of batteries, use of PV, a whole bunch of technologies that can actually reduce that. And of course, if the homes are insulated to a very high standard, say, for example, passive house, and you can retrofit to passive house, it's been done many times, basically you don't need a lot of heat to stop the problems. Cooking would still be a difficulty, but you don't need a lot of heat to keep the occupants warm. They largely keep themselves warm. So yes, it's a problem, but I sometimes think we kind of overstretch it, and it becomes well, we can't fix this particular subset of the problem, so we can't do anything. And I'm very much one for the low-hanging fruit. Let's get on with the bits we can do. Yes, there are problems. I live in one of them. You know, a 17th century stone farmhouse. It's a bugger, but eventually we will have solutions to those as well. Don't use that as an excuse not to get on with what we can do.
Absolutely. Thank you, Richard. Judith, would you like to come in on any of the comments that our panelists have made? Sorry to put you on the spot there.
That's okay. I'm quite happy to do that. I actually live in a listed building. I was just typing something out. I live in a listed building in a village outside Penrith. And yes, I need to do a lot of work to get our property at all, draft proof, never mind better insulated overall. But I must admit, even, you know, we have had electricity cuts for periods of time, not very long. And if the property was a lot better insulated, we would be a lot better off. But I know, talking to people who were dealing with people after Storm Arwen up in Alston, where people are off for a week, and these were elderly people who were struggling not just to cook and heat, but just to charge your mobile phone up, because you then you can keep in touch with people. And they couldn't get, some of them couldn't get out of their properties because trees were down and snow and everything like that. So I'd be very inclined, especially in rural areas, to still keep my wood burning stove. Sorry, I know it's not very environmentally friendly, but in rural areas you can, you haven't got the problems to do with air quality and things like that. So yeah, I'm still got my wood burning stove, and I think I'll still be keeping it as an emergency backup for when we do get cuts. But yeah, it is a big issue there. And having been on Lake District National Park Authority, it's a big issue there, where you've got small traditional ex-miners cottages owned by people like the Lakeland Housing Trust, who do a brilliant job of providing good affordable housing, truly affordable housing, to people in Central Lakes. But how do you insulate those properties when they're stone faced outside? And if you try and put insulation on the walls inside, it's going to make them so much smaller. But yeah, it is. I'm keen to get on. We are doing a lot of things already as Westmoreland and Furness Council, but it is that thing of how do we deal with the deeply rural properties, very traditional, sometimes listed.
Thank you for that insight, Judith. Okay, I've got a couple of hands up. We'll start with you, Neil. Thank you.
I actually know Alston quite well, and I know all the problems that occur with areas like Alston, because I live in one myself. And it raises two questions. Number one is actually our planning policy and our attitude to planning, because renewable forms of energy would be much easier if, of course, the planning permit system actually allowed them to happen. And we've got to be realistic about this, and start thinking in terms about what our actual priorities are. Are they to protect the view of some neighbour, or are we actually serious about zero carbon? So that's the first question, planning. And the second question is, and it's been sort of alluded to as well, we've got all different organisations wandering about with their priorities, which are not actually always consistent with the ones we've just been discussing. Like for example, national parks, the National Trust, and so on. So we've got to engage with them to make sure that they feel tooled up and ready and willing to make the necessary changes to our housing stock and energy supplies. So that's two things which need to be changed, and I think they both require legislation. One is the planning system, and one actually are the agencies that have been effectively entrusted with quite a lot of responsibility, but also the capacity to block progress.
Thank you, Neil. Richard, James, would either of you like to respond?
I'm no expert in the energy system, but my colleagues who are go on endlessly about the problems of the planning system and energy planning. And in particular, they talk about the issue of corridors for the grid. Where can you actually put high voltage lines, particularly above ground, and the difficulty of increasing capacity and setting up new systems to access new wind farms, whether offshore or onshore, things like this. So yes, absolutely, it is an issue, and it's the classic problem of, we know how we work as humans. We break problems down into bite-sized pieces so that we can manage them, we can wrap our minds around them, and then we wonder why there's a lack of coordination between the various parts. We've given people different responsibilities, and if you're going to hold the planning department accountable for a specific set of deliverables and a specific set of outcomes, then someone has to check that those are compatible with the broad thrust of what you're trying to do in society, whether it's about house building, whether it's about handling sewage and the issues around there, whether it's about agricultural waste, whether it's about electricity supply. These are not problems that are easy to solve if you rely on a does anybody object approach to planning.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, I'll come in briefly just to say that we have a worrying case study in Frome, in Somerset, and some smaller examples where large numbers of new builds, where the local authority has pushed the developer to electrify heating in those new builds, but the DNO has turned around and said, no, we don't have capacity when you add on top the EV chargers, etc. So those new builds will now be installed with gas boilers in 2023. Gas boilers which will last a good 15 years. So it is worrying that this lack of communication between the DNO and the local authority about where areas of constraint are, and also then the lack of responsiveness in terms of dealing with those constraints. And definitely sort of in speaking to local authorities, it seems very inconsistent which district network operators actually have a desk officer to talk to stakeholders such as local authorities and to coordinate these sorts of issues.
Thank you. Thanks, James. Hugo Pound, would you like to ask your question?
I would. Thanks, Paula. Sorry, I arrived late as well, so I may have missed one or two of the comments that have already been made, for which I apologise. But just drawing together one comment that Richard made earlier, just as I joined, and James. Richard, you were talking about underpinning financial solutions are required, and I would be interested to explore with others what you think they are and where they reside, whether they reside at central government or whether they come down into different hierarchical levels. And James quite rightly, of course, says that people are asset rich and cash poor, and therefore they don't have either the incentive or the cash to address these sorts of issues. And I'm wondering how we square the circle on that dilemma, which is you can't leave individuals or residents to resolve these issues on their own. So where are the underpinning financial solutions? And secondly, I'm sure many of us either currently sit or have sat on planning, and I'm a portfolio holder for housing and planning. And I think that the NPPF is utterly unfit for purpose, and Gove tinkering on the edges of it is doing absolutely nothing. And I'm wondering again whether people might share with me a view as to whether we should just chuck it on the fire, because at least it would provide some heat in the winter. And whether we should have a much thinner, broader sort of guideline from central government, and then allow local government to define its own local policies for all planning.
Thanks, Hugo. Really interesting comments. Do you want to say which council you represent?
I am. I'm in Tunbridge Wells in Kent.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
The only Remain constituency in Kent. I just thought I'd put that.
Solidarity, my friends.
So Hugo has gone straight for the jugular. Where's the money going to come from? There are a number of interesting ideas. Whether any of them are the solution, I don't know. But for example, on the continent, it is quite common to use low-cost government loans to make it possible for individuals to upgrade their properties. And a couple of examples for this, there's the Hauts-de-France campaign in France, which doesn't cover the whole country, and the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau in Germany. And both of these use the fact that governments can borrow money at a much lower cost to provide low-cost loans to people, but also it's fed through a one-stop shop, so that there is somebody in Germany, it's based around the Landesbanks, so you can go to someone who will say, okay, let me survey your property. Let's have a conversation with you about what you're trying to do. Let's do the design. Let's get someone in to do the design. Let's agree it with you. Let's find the people to do the installations and do the work. Let's source the financing for you. And then let's check that the whole thing has been done properly and works. And what that does is it makes people much more likely to, if you like, invest their part of the money in the project, because they've got that hand holding throughout the process. So I think that's an approach that you can take. At a more commercial level, a number of people, there's a guy called Stephen Fawkes, who has been pushing the idea of energy efficiency right across industry and buildings for many years. And he argues that there are trillions of dollars sloshing around the world looking for a home where they can get a modest but pretty secure return on their investment. And he says this money is going into big solar farms and offshore wind. And the reason for that is that the investments come in billion-dollar sized chunks. Everyone understands how they scale. They're well regulated. The contracts are clear, and it's possible to be pretty sure what you're going to get out of it through contracts for different auctions or whatever. And the practical upshot of that is that the money that is available is going into that kind of investment, and it's not going into upgrading the buildings and improving the efficiency of the built environment, which we need to do at the same time. And his argument is we need to find a way to roll up things into much bigger projects and then use standardized contracts to bring in that money which is available. Now, whether he's right or wrong, I don't know. So that's another idea. And then a third idea that the Green Finance Initiative has been looking at, particularly applies to private owner occupiers, is the idea of land value taxes which are based on the efficiency of the building. So adjusting council tax, adjusting stamp duty when you sell a property or buy a property, adjusting that in relation to the efficiency of the building. And that could be made revenue neutral because, of course, you up one and if they're not efficient, you increase it. If they are efficient, you reduce it. Doesn't address the issue of the asset-rich, cash-poor people, but it's another idea. So I think there are several ideas out there about how you could move things around to make it easier for people to make the sensible decisions. And that could be applied to social landlords as well, particularly in the case of low cost financing from governments, government agencies would be a way of doing that.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to bring in, we've got Councillor Graham Turner.
I'm just following on. So I'm Councillor Graham Turner. I represent Kirklees, and I'm the Cabinet Member for Finance and Regeneration. Just going back to the issue of the planning system, we seem to have been forever in limbo with planning. I sat on planning for 10 years, so I've seen it from that side, and now responsible for policy and strategy on planning. And we seem to be in limbo for years and years, with consultation after consultation coming out from Grove's office, going back, and nothing changing on it. And it's holding everybody back. We don't know what to do, because when are they going to bring the changes in? What changes are they going to be? So it really does restrict long-term strategy. I'm in the process of looking at whether I need to actually rip our local plan up, because it's becoming clear it's not fit for purpose. But it's going to be challenging, because until we get some direction from government, what are we going to include in that? So planning is an issue around a lot of this. Someone mentioned earlier planning being underfunded. There is a certain element of truth in that. The problem with planning is there's a national shortage of planning officers. So in some ways, yes, whilst we're underfunded, it doesn't include, it won't solve the problem immediately. We haven't invested enough in training planning officers. We haven't invested enough in developing their careers. So we're now faced with the problem where there's a national shortage. And it's certainly in this part of the world, where I'm in a large area with a lot of metropolitan councils, planning officers move around on a regular basis, because we're all poaching each other's staff all the time. And we shouldn't be doing that. But that's what happens. One of our planners leaves, and then 3 weeks later he takes 2 others with him. So it's an actual national shortage of planning officers as well that we need to address. And there are reasons for that, which I'm not going to go into now, all the reasons I think there are around that. But we do need to look at how we get more planning officers in and get this planning issue sorted with government, because we're in limbo. It's ridiculous.
Thanks, Graham.
Nice to see you, Paula, anyway.
Yeah, good to see you too, Graham. Richard, James, do either of you want to respond to the points that Graham made there?
I'll come in on planning. So the RTPI, as I mentioned earlier, has pointed out how underfunded the planning sector is. In terms of the staff shortage, I don't have an idea about what would specifically solve that, although I imagine that funding would go some way in terms of introducing sustainability in that sector, making it easier work for people, rather than sort of the stories I've heard from planners where they have to deal with hundreds and hundreds of these tiny applications, and asking them to do any more in terms of sustainability is thoroughly rejected. One thing that I do know about is that the restrictions on heat pumps relating to noise, size, and distance to boundary fences is extra work for planners that is almost entirely unnecessary now that heat pumps are very quiet. And heat pumps actually now might need to get a bit bigger to be more efficient and also to be quieter, and that there are these sort of arbitrary size constraints on heat pumps which could be removed.
Thank you, James. And what I'm going to do now is just move to a couple of the pre-submitted questions that we have. So if we can just ask for sort of fairly brief answers, if I may, because we are unfortunately nearly at the end of this particular panel session this morning. One question which is relevant from Tony Wells: why the building regulations do not make it compulsory to have solar panels on all new housing?
I'm not sure, but local governments should be able to set whether or not this is sort of appropriate based on the housing archetypes and the geographic considerations in their local area. Might not be appropriate in London, but may be appropriate in other areas in the country. So another area where it could be sort of devolved.
Absolutely, thank you. And we also have a question from Councillor Stephen Clark. I don't know if you're on the call, Stephen, at the moment, but you have asked what percentage of levelling up funds have been allocated to rural areas. So, Richard, James, I don't know how easy it is to quantify that, but I wonder if you've got any thoughts.
I don't know. What hasn't happened so far, I think, and I think a lot of politicians would recognise this, is we have not begun to deal with the challenge that bringing the energy efficiency of rural properties and dealing with off-grid and all the rest of it, it hasn't been given enough attention yet. And that's partly because right now we can make huge gains by leaving those till later.
I can say that the home upgrade grant, which is specifically for off-grid homes, is meant to spend 0.85 billion this Parliament, so it's 2025, and that currently the energy company obligation, which is meant to spend £1 billion a year, but spends about half that. A large amount of that is currently going to rural homes on account of the fact that it's very biased towards it, and that is actually not very efficient. But there is quite a lot of money currently, well, more than was previously available for rural homes. There is, in fact, no dedicated local government gas on-grid scheme now that local authority delivery of the Green Homes Grant closed.
Thank you. Okay, Richard, James, can I just ask if you have any final points you'd like to make before we conclude this panel this morning?
None from me, just thanks for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you very much for your time, and we really appreciate your participation, both of you.
I think it's the same message from me. Just to come back to the how do we have the right conversations? This is not a problem that gets solved by the energy companies or the local authorities or the housing associations. This is something that touches everything. And in particular, I think we need to get much better at understanding the value of the knock-on benefits. You know, those spillover benefits to health. You can clearly cut costs to the health service by improving the quality of housing. You can improve the economy, you can improve education. So I think, you know, being able to hold those complicated, you know, what does it cost and who wins conversations in our head and have the right conversations is an important part of the process.
Thank you very much, and thank you both for excellent contributions this morning. You're welcome to stay for the rest of the inquiry this morning, but we also appreciate it if you do need to go. So thanks again.